So I'll be continuing to read Chapter 10 in Joseph Campbell's book on primitive mythology. We're in Section 3 on the Great Diffusion. And today we'll be reading about the southeastward diffusion. The archaeology of India entered a new phase in the early 20s of the present century, when a dramatic revelation of archaic cities antedating the arrival of the Vedic Aryans occurred at three widely separated sites in the Indus Valley: Mohenjo-daro, Chandhu-daro, and Harappa. The first two being in the lower quarter of the valley and the last in the Punjab, far to the north. The dating is circa 2500 to 1200/1000 BC. But earlier levels, since discovered in India, suggest a Neolithic base going back perhaps to the 4th millennium. The beasts domesticated were the humped, long-horned Indian bull, a short-horned bull, the pig, buffalo, dog, horse, sheep, and elephant. Spinning and weaving were known, and the metals were gold, silver, copper, tin, and lead. Side by side with the metal tools, however, were knives made of flakes of chert, as well as stone axes and maces, revealing that even in the latest levels of this culture province, the influence of the Neolithic age had not completely passed. 4 stages can be readily distinguished in the Indian series. 1. The pre-Harappan simple village cultures of perhaps the late 4th millennium BC. Derivation by way of Iran from the Mesopotamian mythogenetic zone is indicated by the painted pottery styles. But the level of civilization was considerably below that of the contemporary High Neolithic and hieratic city-states of Mesopotamia. The architecture is poorly developed. Metal is either unknown or little used, and the industries are chiefly of pottery, chert, and shell. The familiar triangular zigzag, meander, checker, lozenge, and double axe motifs appear, as well as, once again, a series of crude female statuettes, often associated with figures of the bull, and some even with evidences of human sacrifice. 2. The so-called Harappa stage of the great cities of Mohenjo-daro, Chandhu-daro, and Harappa, circa 2500 to 1200/1000 BC, which bursts abruptly into view without preparation, already fully formed and showing many completely obvious signs of inspiration from the earlier high centers of the West, yet undeniable signs also of a native Indian tradition, this too already well developed. As Professor W. Norman Brown has suggested, a native Indian center, that is, a mythogenetic zone, somewhere either in the south or in the Ganges-Jumna area would seem to be indicated, where the characteristically Indian traits, unknown at this time, farther west, must have come into form. For on 2 of the stamp seals of the period we find figures seated on low thrones in the meditating yoga posture. One of these is flanked by 2 kneeling worshippers and rearing serpents, while the other, with 2 gazelles reposing beneath his seat, is surrounded by 4 wild beasts, a water buffalo, rhinoceros, elephant, and tiger. It is well known that precisely these compositions are associated in later Hindu and Buddhist art both with the god Shiva and with the Buddha. One can only suppose that the practice of yoga must already have been developed and associated with the concept of a heightened state of consciousness, not only worthy of worship but also capable of quelling and fascinating the animal world, like the music of Orpheus in the later tradition of the Greeks. The presence of serpents in the attitude of attendant worshippers or protectors, furthermore, indicates that the well-known serpent daemon, Naga, motif that plays with such a conspicuous role in later Indian religion had already been evolved. No doubt from the primitive theme of the monster serpent of the abyss. We have referred to the imagery of the god Vishnu reclining on the cosmic serpent, which in turn is floating on the cosmic waters. The supporting energy and substance of the universe, and consequently of the individual, is imaged in India in the figure of the serpent. And the yogi is the master of this power, both in himself, in his control of his own spiritual and physical states, and in the world, in his magical mastery of the phenomena of nature. The seated yogi among the beasts wears on his head a curious headdress with a crown and two immense horns, which, as Heinrich Zimmer has pointed out, resembles to a striking degree one of the most prominent symbols of early Buddhist art, the sign of the so-called three jewels, symbolizing the Buddha, the doctrine, and the order of the Buddha's followers, which is in the form of a kind of trident. The Hindu god Shiva carries a trident also, and among the Greeks, as we know, this same sign was the attribute of Poseidon, Neptune, the god of the watery deep. Another important art miniature of the period is a well-formed stone torso, 3 3/4 inches high, of a male dancer in a posture suggesting that of the later dancing Shiva of the South Indian bronzes. The figure apparently was ithyphallic, which would have accorded with Shiva's character as a phallic as well as meditative god. And yet another dancer, a beautifully cast copper female nude, 4 1/4 inches high, indicates further that already in the 2nd millennium BC the temple dance had been developed, which in India, until most recent times, has been one of the principal liturgical arts. But with this we are back on familiar ground, for have we not read that Inanna, the queen of heaven, who abandoned heaven, abandoned earth, and to the netherworld descended, was the Hierodule, the slave girl dancer of the gods? Among the stamp seals of the Harappa culture, there is one showing the apparition of a goddess wearing a headdress of 3 horns, somewhat like that of the god whom we have just discussed, and there is a worshipper obeisant before her, accompanied by a strange sort of man-faced chimera, while a chorus of exactly 7 pig-tailed attendants stands in the foreground in a measured row. Ceramic female figurines discovered in dwellings likewise point to an extension of the cult of the goddess from the Near East. However, there have been found, in addition to these images, a number of simple sexual symbols, cone-shaped or phallic erect stones, denoting the male, and circular stones with a hollow center representing the female. Such primitive forms, known as lingam and yoni, are still the most common objects of worship in India, whether in temples, in the open country, or in the household cult. Surviving from the tradition of the Neolithic, they outnumber statistically all the other types of Indian sacred images and occur most commonly in association specifically with Shiva and his goddess Devi. In brief, then, the evidence indicates that in the course of the 3rd millennium BC, a powerful influence from the Mesopotamian mythogenetic zone on the levels of the High Neolithic and of the hieratic city-state reached India by way of Iran. It touched here, however, another mythogenetic zone of considerable force, of which up to this time there had been left no indubitable archaeological evidence. Among the leading elements of this suddenly revealed native Indian mythogenetic complex we may number the serpent as a development of the primitive proto-Neolithic monster serpent of the tropical planters, the yogi as a higher transformation of the shamanistic techniques and experiences of ecstasis, the goddess, though in what way or to what degree differently conceived and developed from the goddess of the Mediterranean sphere, we cannot say, and the abstract symbol of sexual union, lingam and yoni in conjunction. as a primary symbol of the divine connubium through which the world is simultaneously generated and dissolved. Among the elements and ideas imported, on the other hand, were certainly writing, the art of the stamp seal, polychrome pottery, wheeled vehicles, metalcraft, grain agriculture, stock breeding, the idea of the city, and possibly the hieratic city-state. Almost without question, also, the later Indian ideas of duty, dharma, and the round of rebirth, samsara, the cosmic mountain crowned with the city of the gods, the underworlds of suffering and upper worlds of bliss, the kingly solar and lunar dynasties, and the sacral regicide were derived from Mesopotamia. Likewise, the sacred bull and cow as theriomorphic counterparts of the lingam and yoni. But a characteristic inflection was given to all these, in which it is difficult not to recognize a native Indian impulse, and which, even though not earlier represented in tangible evidence, may well derive at least from late Capsian, Mesolithic times. A number of the seals, it should be furthermore noted, show the forms of certain trees and plants that are regarded as sacred in India to this day. And finally, some of the bulls look like unicorns, though perhaps only as a consequence of inept perspective. 3. From the middle of the second millennium onward, an epoch-making new development, the entry into India of the Vedic Aryans, remote cousins of the Homeric Greeks, who were penetrating the Balkans at the same time, both perhaps being direct descendants of the people of the Kurgans and Ochre Graves discussed in the description of the northwestward diffusion. With the coming of these Aryans, the higher civilization of the Indus cities was destroyed, and a new age initiated, in which the male gods of a nomadic herding people for a time triumphed, and seemed to have triumphed forever over the goddess of the soil-rooted city-states. The Vedic heroic age is to be dated circa 1500 to 500 BC, and the archaeology of this millennium is practically a total blank. For the early Indo-Aryans, like the early Greeks, neither built in stone nor committed their traditions to writing. Their sacred books, the Vedas, Brahmanas, and Upanishads, no less than their two great epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, were communicated only orally until sometime following the 3rd century BC, so that everything not regarded as worthy of a special school of rememberers was lost. 4. A period from circa 500 BC to circa 500 AD, when the Aryan Vedic tradition and the earlier so-called Dravidian Harappa traditions gradually combined to form the great structures of modern Hinduism and Indian medieval Buddhism, whereupon India became the primary mythogenetic zone of the whole later Orient, sending its philosophically illuminated mythologies and mythologically illustrated philosophies northward and eastward into Tibet, Mongolia, China, Korea, and Japan, southward and eastward to Ceylon, Burma, Cambodia, Thailand, and Indonesia, and even westward, though with less force, into the Alexandrian sphere. The principal figures in this development were Gautama Buddha, 563 to 483 BC, the Buddhist emperor Ashoka, circa 274 to 237 BC, who sent, according to his own report, missions to Ceylon, Macedonia, and Alexandrian Egypt, the anonymous author of the Hindu Bhagavad Gita, the Buddhist emperor Kanishka, circa 78 to 123 AD, in whose time the Buddhist law was carried to China, the Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna, circa 200 AD, whose paradoxical teachings of the full void represent perhaps the culmination of the history of metaphysical speculation, The myriads of anonymous craftsmen to whom the world owes the glorious art of India's Maurya, Andhra, and Gupta periods, and again those anonymous priests and poets through whom India's medieval Puranic and Tantric traditions were developed. Through all these, the compound inheritance of the two great mythogenetic zones of the hieratic city-state and the yogic awakening of the serpent power were wrought into mankind's most radiant vision of the harmony of being.